Good afternoon, everyone. This is Harry Campbell. I'm the senior scientist in the Pennsylvania office of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and I welcome you and thank you for being here today. And hopefully you will learn and enjoy a little bit about the state of the Chesapeake Bay in this presentation. We'll be hitting some highlights and talking about what the Bay is to all of us and some ideas and opportunities that each and every one of us may be able to participate in that will help not only restore the integrity of our local rivers and streams here in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, but ultimately will actually quantitatively and significantly affect the Chesapeake Bay. So, the state of the Bay. Well, before we understand the Chesapeake Bay and its influence on our own lives, we have to realize that water surrounds us. It is part of us. And quite frankly, it sustains us. 2/3 of the Earth's surface, as you see here, is actually covered by water. Of that, only 2.4% of the Earth's water is fresh water that is very vital to our economy and quality of life. And of that 2.4%, only 0.8% is surface water that makes up our rivers, our streams, our reservoirs, our lakes, and our wetlands. Yet that water, that fresh surface water, is very vital to our economies. In fact, water and its living resources sustains our economies locally and regionally. In fact, 70% of Pennsylvanians get their water from drinking water sources that are surface sources, rivers and streams and lakes. Those living resources also provide a significant economic engine that is dependent on clean and fresh and abundant water for commerce in local and regional economies. In fact, nationally, surface water provides $6.6 trillion in economic services nationally each and every year. In the Chesapeake Bay region, the fisheries industry, including both shellfish and finfish, is a significant part of the region's local economy. A 2008 fisheries study by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, indicates that commercial seafood industry in Maryland and Virginia contributed to $2 billion in sales, $1 billion in income, and supported over 41,000 jobs within the region. The economic benefits of saltwater recreational fishing are equally impressive, contributing $1.6 billion in sales, and in turn contributed more than $800 million in additional economic activity and supports over 13,000 jobs. Water, clean, fresh, abundant water, also sustains, particularly in Pennsylvania, agriculture. Agriculture relies on clean and abundant water supplies to support crops and animals. And water sustains us in our recreational activities and is a vital component to our economy here in Pennsylvania and our quality of life. In fact, surface water provides not only $6.6 trillion annually in national economic services, but the Fish and Boat Commission of Pennsylvania estimates that fishermen and boaters spend over $2.5 billion each year in the state of Pennsylvania. That results in more than $106 billion in related economic output. But our waters tell a story that is a reflection back to us on how we treat the land. Water's health and its vitality, and by extension that of our society, is determined by our everyday decisions and priorities. It reflects our understanding of the land and our stewardship of that land. Water reflects back to us, for instance, on how we treat our forests, the fragmentation of forests for subdivisions and strip malls, and mining and drilling activities. Forests once consumed nearly all of Pennsylvania. They provide critical habitat for wildlife and cool, clean water to economically and ecologically important species like the native Pennsylvania brook trout. Today, most forests in Pennsylvania are privately owned and left unprotected by state or local governmental regulations or ordinances. This has led to a high level of fragmentation and a high degree of vulnerability. Water also reflects back to us on how agriculture treats the land, for instance, through the use of passé practices such as unmanaged access of farm animals to streams, where they can directly deposit pollution sources in the case of manure or excess chemical fertilizers that carry along bacteria, viruses, pharmaceuticals, and phosphorus and nitrogen pollution. They trample the bed and banks of streams and can strip vital vegetation alongside those stream banks. Water reflects back to us through the historical and current extraction and consumption of fossil fuels for our own energy-dependent activities. Water reflects back to us through the hyper-conversion of open space to manicured lawns, cookie-cutter subdivisions, and strip malls and parking lots, which between 1992 and 2005 increased by 131% in Pennsylvania, while at the very same time, the population of Pennsylvania grew by only 4.5%, near the bottom nationally. Water reflects back to us our forgotten and outdated, failing infrastructure, which can lead to poorly, and in some cases, discharges of untreated sewage to our local rivers and streams. In fact, Pennsylvania has the largest number of combined sewer overflows, or discharge points at which raw sewage may be discharged into local rivers and streams during heavy rain events, than any other state in the nation. Within the Susquehanna River basin, where the Susquehanna River lies in the northern and central parts of the state, there are over 400 discrete points at which raw sewage can be discharged into the Susquehanna River and its tributaries. And the large number of Pennsylvania's local sewage treatment plants have relied heavily on 1970s treatment technologies for the past several decades. Such technologies offered little in the way of removing phosphorus and sediment pollution from even treated discharges. Water reflects actually back to us too the pollution that is in the air from coal-fired power plants, farm animals and farm equipment, and even our own car exhaust that we put into our air, into our lungs, can eventually find its way into the water when it rains or when it snows. All of these decisions, past and current, individual and collective, have resulted in today there being over 18,000 miles of streams within Pennsylvania that are considered to be impaired under the Federal Clean Water Act. Sometimes these streams are devoid of nearly all easily discernible forms of life. The largest source of this impairment is from the legacy of coal mining in the form of acidic or acid mine drainage. Acid mine drainage is not only acidic, but it can contain toxic metals. And although such discharge is not a source of nutrient pollution or nitrogen and phosphorus pollution per se, because many of these streams are dead ecologically, they have severely depressed the natural metabolism of those streams. That metabolism, as a result, cannot actually attenuate any pollution that enters into those streams, even from natural sources, and is therefore shuttled downstream instead of being taken up and used for food and energy by living creatures in that stream. The influence of agriculture is the second leading cause of stream impairment to the state of Pennsylvania. It is a large source of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment pollution, particularly in south central Pennsylvania. Agricultural practices can negatively influence water quality through manure and fertilizer applications and sediment-laden runoff from the land, the loss of vegetation alongside streams, and the unmanaged access of animals to creeks, as we saw earlier. However, unlike many other sources of pollution, agricultural problems are relatively easy and cheap to fix, and farmland can always revert back to meadow and forests. As such, outside of forests, a well-managed, sustainable, and conservation-based farm is often the preferred land use as it relates to water quality protection and restoration, both in the state of Pennsylvania and within the Chesapeake Bay region. And then our water reflects back to us, and the third leading influence to stream impairment in Pennsylvania is runoff from our towns and suburbs. Impervious surfaces such as parking lots, rooftops, sidewalks, streets, these impervious surfaces, and even in some cases, I dare say, compacted lawns, fundamentally change the water cycle, resulting in vast amounts of runoff, where water once soaked into the ground. When it rains, pollutants that land on these impervious surfaces can hitch a ride, where runoff and then runoff into the nearest river and stream, relatively untreated and unabated. And over the last decade, studies have begun to show that within the Susquehanna River itself, particularly in the lower portions of the Susquehanna River, there are signs of stress and disease. And once a world-class fishery, the smallmouth bass population, is now showing dire signs of such disease and unprecedented levels of death for young or baby fish within that portion of the Susquehanna River. You can see on this slide, the opaque areas on these two fish are called lesions. They are areas where the fish's natural defenses have broken down and the scales have begun to erode away. Eventually, this leads to their untimely death. Within the Susquehanna River, simultaneously, a new form of filamentous algae has exploded in growth within the lower Susquehanna River, called cladophoria. Blooms since the 2007 have exploded in their extent and area within the lower Susquehanna River. These areas are key indicators of what is known as eutrophication, or excess amounts of nutrients in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution are often associated with this form of filamentous algae. And flooding events of the last years have sent unprecedented amounts of sediment pollution not only into the Susquehanna River, but into the Chesapeake Bay. So much so that one can see the influence of the Susquehanna River on the bay for well over 100 miles, extending into the Chesapeake Bay itself. Ultimately, water flows somewhere. And for half of Pennsylvania, it flows to the Chesapeake Bay via, as we just saw, the Susquehanna River. The Susquehanna River actually starts in Cooperstown, New York. It's a little stream that you can basically jump across. By the time it reaches Havre de Grace, Maryland, it's almost over a mile wide. But that flow of the Susquehanna River is 444 miles to the Chesapeake Bay. It actually provides 50% of the fresh water entering into the Chesapeake Bay and 90% of the fresh water in the upper regions of the bay. In fact, in many ways, the health of the bay is simply a reflection of the health of the Susquehanna River. The Chesapeake Bay is North America's largest estuary and is the third largest estuary in the world. The watershed, which drains not only the Susquehanna River but major river systems in Maryland and Virginia and half of Delaware, is 64,000 square miles in size. It has more than 11,600 miles of shoreline, longer than that of the entire west coast of the United States. No other estuary in the world has the land-to-water ratio of the Chesapeake Bay. That means the influence of how we treat the land has a profound effect on the health of the Chesapeake Bay. So given what we know, how is the bay doing? The state of the bay rates the bay's health on a scale of 1 to 100. 0 representing a decimated bay, 100 representing a pristine bay when Captain John Smith first sailed the Chesapeake some 400 years ago. Although 31, as you see on this slide, is an improvement from historical lows, it still represents and means that the Chesapeake Bay is on EPA's, or the Federal Clean Water Act's, impaired list of water bodies, just like those 18,000 miles of impaired streams for the state of Pennsylvania. We need to get to a score of 40 to get off of this impaired waters list. And a score of 70 means that we not only have a truly resilient and sustainable bay, but that is the time at which we can say to ourselves, the bay is truly been saved. A driving factor as to why the bay is at a 31 in terms of its overall health score is the dissolved oxygen levels in the water. Fish, crabs, oysters, all living creatures really breathe oxygen, and that includes anything that lives in the water. They breathe oxygen just like we breathe oxygen from the air. On average, each year, large portions of the bay, however, do not have enough oxygen to adequately sustain aquatic life for at least some periods of time during the year. These dead zones vary year to year and move depending on wind speeds, direction, precipitation, and even the amount of pollution that enters the Chesapeake Bay for that particular year. But these areas of red are effectively dead zones, areas in which aquatic life cannot sustain itself. And unless that aquatic life can move or run out of the way of these red dead zones that move like the Blob, if you're familiar with that movie, unless they can get out of the way, they may suffer an untimely death or significant disease. So how do we fix this problem? We know that there are issues with pollution, and we know that pollution has greatly reduced the region's historic populations of oysters, crabs, and fish. The loss of natural filters, such as oysters, underwater grasses, and wetlands have compounded these pollution problems. This decline in the health of our rivers and streams, and ultimately the Chesapeake Bay, has cost the area billions of dollars in lost jobs, revenue, and resources, and threatens to be a continuing drag on the local and state economies for years to come. Right now, this is the Chesapeake Bay. It is currently under what is known as, in this slide, the degradation cycle. The biggest problem is that this pollution in the form of nitrogen, sediment, and phosphorus pollution actually causes what you can think of as like calories for people. Too many calories over a long period of time lead to an unhealthy population or an unhealthy condition in our bodies. Likewise, too many phosphorus and sediments and nitrogen pollution create big problems downstream in the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is essentially overfed. The degradation cycle goes like this. Too many nutrients create algal blooms. Too much algae, decreasing water clarity, and this algae is short-lived and dies quickly. Excess algae sinks and decomposes, sucking out oxygen from the water, stressing oysters, fish, and other aquatic life, and causing them to become diseased and or die. We go from this to this. This becomes, when a restoration cycle initiates, we reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus and sediment entering into these river systems and ultimately the Chesapeake Bay. Clarity is improved. Fish and wildlife populations begin to thrive. Algal blooms decrease significantly. The dissolved oxygen level increases. The submerged aquatic vegetation, the vegetation that lives in the water, begins to regenerate and reoxygenate the water. And life restores itself to healthy populations, sustainable populations that are not only good for the environment, but sustain our economies as well. Fortunately or unfortunately, we know what needs to be done, and the goals are not exactly new. We've been at this for a long time. We have been through decades of unsuccessful attempts to restore the Chesapeake Bay. Leaders have made promises and states have set goals that have gone unmet. So in response to this continued failure on the part of the states and the federal government to meet their clean water goals for the Chesapeake Bay, pursuant to a court order in 1999, the United States Environmental Protection Agency was required to establish in 2010 something called a total maximum daily load. This is a blueprint for clean water. It is the guide map at which we can then begin in earnest the regulatory requirements of restoring the Chesapeake Bay. This TMDL, or the Chesapeake Bay Clean Water Blueprint, which is a scientifically based methodology, aims to reduce pollution in the bay by approximately 25% from current levels. The good thing is we're about halfway there. Over the decades, when we started this effort in earnest in 1995, to where we are today, we have reduced pollution through the efforts of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and a multitude of others, reduced pollution by about half of where it needs to be. The bad news is we're about halfway there. And there are many obstacles: apathy, bay fatigue, as it's sometimes called, anti-clean water legislation, lawsuits, and a bad economy all threaten to derail this state and federal partnership to restore the Chesapeake Bay. But there is reason for hope. There's good news. Most scientific experts consider this the Chesapeake's best chance for a real restoration. The problems have been identified. We have the know-how and the tools to fix them. And the benefits of a restored bay manifestly outweigh the cleanup costs. If we can work together to make the pollution limits work, many scientists believe the Chesapeake Bay will reach a tipping point in the near future when these improvements outpace pollution, and the Chesapeake Bay will rebound exponentially. How do we do this? Well, through many different methodologies. But this may include, for instance, accelerating how we manage the runoff from our lawns, from our streets, from our rooftops, by changing the way we treat stormwater in our urban and suburban areas, to create practices which act as filters and sinks to polluted runoff, not shuttling it to the nearest receiving water body. In fact, in Pennsylvania and throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, older boroughs and cities and even suburbs prior to the 1970s simply shuttled stormwater untreated through pipes to the nearest receiving water body. Starting in the late 80s, or excuse me, the early 1980s, newer developments were required to provide flood control in the forms of what is known as detention basins, these holes in the ground, if you will. While these helped, as areas developed, they were found not to be as effective for flood control as hoped. And scientists and engineers have determined that these detention basins, particularly those that are dry between rain events, are very poor at removing pollutants from stormwater. The additional runoff in terms of volume and velocity can cause also erosion in stream beds and banks, which further exacerbates pollution from urbanized areas. This slide shows the urban practice called a rain garden. It's simply a landscaped area designed to capture and treat stormwater runoff. In this photo, the rain garden can capture runoff from the roof and the lawn of the home. Notice that there is a curb cut along the road. This allows road runoff to enter into this rain garden as well. Road runoff, research suggests, is a large proportion of the polluted stormwater that is created in developments. Collectively, practices such as this are called green infrastructure. New developments which use green infrastructure and special site design techniques are often called low-impact design developments. We also achieve restoration by restoring our streams and reforesting our stream banks, getting away from those years of neglect, restoring the natural course of vegetation that once populated all of Pennsylvania streams, trees. Providing trees and shrubberies alongside these streams banks has innumerable benefits associated with water quality, as well as improvement in fisheries and other aquatic life populations. Restoration also means progressing towards and continuing to invest in infrastructure upgrades, bringing our sewage treatment plants, the pipes and pumps along with the treatment technologies into the 21st century. As I noted earlier, Pennsylvania leads the nation in the number of combined sewer overflows or raw sewage discharge points in the nation. And many wastewater treatment plants in Pennsylvania relied on 1970s technologies with little or no removal of nitrogen and phosphorus from their discharges. But starting in 2010, Pennsylvania undertook a vast change in the way that we dealt with this pollution. For now, beginning in 2010, these sources of pollution have regulatory limits in the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen that they can discharge into the Susquehanna River Basin and Potomac River basins of Pennsylvania that ultimately flow into the Chesapeake Bay. In response to these requirements, wastewater treatment plants throughout this part of the state are either upgrading their treatment technologies to treat nitrogen and phosphorus much more effectively, or they are purchasing credits, if you will, from farmers or other facilities which are exceeding their requirements so as to then achieve that equivalent reduction in pollution. It also means restoration, preserving open space, and working farms, which I noted earlier outside of forests, can be the most ecologically beneficial land use, not only to our local rivers and streams, but to the Chesapeake Bay as well. And these types of agricultural settings, a well-managed, sustainable, conservation-based farm, has innumerable benefits not only to the health and quality of the environment, but also to our historical, cultural identity, particularly in south central Pennsylvania. And by excluding livestock, like in this photo, from streams and fencing it and providing livestock with alternative water sources while restoring native trees, grasses, and shrubs alongside stream banks, we can make significant inroads not only in the health and vitality of our local farming community, but in the health and vitality of the water quality that the second leading cause of impairment in Pennsylvania has in agricultural runoff. We at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation strive to save the bay and its rivers and streams that feed into it. With the help of over 200,000 members and almost 200 staff, our organization began its work back in 1967 when a small group of concerned businessmen formed this nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting, preserving, and saving Chesapeake Bay. We have offices in Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. Our headquarters, located on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay, is the first building in the world to achieve Platinum LEED status. LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. This Platinum LEED status makes Chesapeake Bay Foundation's headquarters the first Platinum LEED and the greenest building in the world. In the Pennsylvania office, One thing that we have focused in on, and throughout our 64,000 square mile watershed area that the organization covers, we have made restoration across the watershed as a fundamental key point of our initiatives. Working on the ground in communities, restoring critical habitat and fisheries and macroinvertebrate or aquatic life populations has been a key goal, whether it be oyster restoration in Maryland, or underwater grass restoration projects in Virginia, or in Pennsylvania, the restoration of streamside forests. CBF is committed to helping create on-the-ground solutions to water quality problems. In Pennsylvania, our restoration efforts have been focused in on restoring and protecting local streams by repairing and restoring our streamside forests. With our 5 field staff since 1997, CBF has worked directly with over 4,000 landowners to restore over 2,200 miles of streamside forest, often called forested buffers, and over 8,000 acres of wetlands. We take streams that in 1997 looked like this to this, the same location, the same stream, but 12 years later. These forests grow up to provide essential habitat at the edge of the stream, but also shade, keeping waters cool. They provide filtration, holding sediments and absorbing nutrients before they get into the water. The trees slow down water, reducing erosion during storm events. And scientific studies have shown that these types of reforested streams have better in-stream processing of pollution as well, particularly nitrogen pollution. So this helps foster and reduce pollution even further. CBF's award-winning environmental education program has also been one of our cornerstones in our efforts to reverse the Bay's decline for decades. Environmental education for students, teachers, and adults has led to demonstrable improvement and engagement with local communities. We work with over 40,000 students and teachers and decision makers on field education programs, getting firsthand experience connecting them to the water and its wildlife. In Pennsylvania, our Susquehanna Watershed Education Program, or SWEP, educates over 1,700 students and 200 teachers each and every year. Begun in 1990, the program runs over 90-day trips each year, including many membership trips. We also engage in advocacy and policy work because fundamentally we have to change and continue to work towards sustaining, restoring, and increasing, in many cases, initiatives that are public policy based and legislatively based. So we work to engage both our members and the general public in the decision-making process and to work with local, state, and federal leaders to help ensure we have sufficient public policy to protect not only clean water in our own backyard, but in the Chesapeake Bay. And occasionally, after careful and thoughtful and purposeful consideration, we have and will employ litigation to protect our waters and the Bay. Usually these issues are either broad in scope or set in an important precedent in the region. Litigation often allows us to leverage our public policy work in significant ways to ultimately fundamentally change the playing field within the Chesapeake Bay region. We also ask people to stay informed and contact their elected representatives to tell them what you expect of them and to support clean water and to vote accordingly. By joining CBF, there is strength in numbers, and you help us make you and us have our voice heard in the halls of Congress and in your state legislators. You can also help us by adopting low-impact lifestyle in your everyday life, which can make a significant impact and save you money in the long run, improve your quality of life, and demonstrate to others your commitment to future generations and the Chesapeake Bay. Converting lawns to native trees, shrubs, and flowers improves soils, increases infiltration of stormwater, and beautifies the landscapes. Rain barrels can capture rooftop runoff for later use. Living in a compacted neighborhood close to shopping and work reduces traffic and offers passive recreation through walking and biking. And converting driveways and sidewalks to pervious material reduces the generation of stormwater runoff. And buying your food from local farms supports local economies, reduces transportation impacts, and connects you to local farmers. Today, after decades of hard work by thousands of farmers, politicians, businesses, and citizens like you, we stand before the prospect of a restored bay. But there are also those who wish to maintain the status quo, to drive us back into the precipice, undoing hard work of the past. Today is the day. Today is the moment in time for the Chesapeake Bay. The choice is ours. We know what has to be done to save the bay, but do we have the will to do it? Thank you. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'd like to say good day, and it has been a pleasure speaking with you. I hope you have found this educational and informative. Thank you so much for your time, and feel free to contact us if you have any other questions or concerns. My name is Harry Campbell, Senior Scientist with the Pennsylvania Office of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation.